Hey, everybody. Welcome to our first Autistic Perspective series of 2022, focusing on ableism. We've got 4 awesome panelists for you to listen to today and ask questions from later. I'm going to be moderating. You can send me messages in the chat. This is recorded, so you'll get a link for it later, and it'll be something that you can access for a few weeks after it's sent to you, and then it'll move to being private. Everybody was sent the bios of the panelists, so I'm not gonna read those through to you right now. I'd rather just kind of jump into the questions. I'm super excited that today ended up being a professional development day for DPS, and that we've got so many teachers here. We had over 50 people register, so we're pretty stoked about that. All right, I'm gonna keep admitting people to the room, but let us jump into the first question. We've got 4 questions that we kind of thought about in advance, and all the panelists will address, and then we'll open it up. Just ask that as questions happen that we all allow for processing time, and pauses are totally okay. All right. So the first question that panelists I'd like for you all to jump into is, what ways do you see the autistic community experience ableism, and where do you see a neurotypical privilege? What are your personal experiences or otherwise?
I can start the ball rolling on that. Well, for me, it's a little bit different because I was very late diagnosed. I was diagnosed at the age of 46. So I knew that I was different, but there was never a conversation about it, never had a name for it. So I never had to address it. So I didn't experience a lot of ableism in terms of a diagnosis prior to having one. Once I got my diagnosis and revealed it, that's when everything started to change. It could change slowly over a period of time, or it could be very instant. I could be at a doctor's appointment, and they may see it in my record that I'm autistic, but not at the beginning. We would have a regular conversation, and then as soon as they were aware that I have autism, then they may choose to speak to me slower and a little bit louder, as if my hearing suddenly changed because I'm autistic or something like that. But I think the most excruciating part of it has been for me as an advocate and working in many boardrooms, finding ableism in the boardroom has been the most uncomfortable for me. Coming in as a person and being very open about it. And I chose to be open about it for that very reason, because I think people need to understand that we are present and we are a part of the fabric of society, and I don't have to hide my identity, and I refuse to do that. So in doing so, oftentimes I find that I'm not necessarily included in the serious conversations unless I have proven myself worthy. So that's the kind of thing I've experienced. And even within the realm of family, they all obviously knew that I was different, that something was very different about me all my life, and not knowing a diagnosis. But again, it's almost as if because I'm different, they haven't quite figured out how to love me or talk to me, or have really even attempted to have just regular conversations and getting to know me. However, my son, who's also on the autism spectrum, but his traits are a little bit more visible than mine. He's very well accepted because he fits the mold of what they feel like autism should look like. So that's been my experience.
I would agree. Like, that's a good point. I'm on the spectrum myself. I have Asperger's. I say ASD, even though they want to label it all the same. I think it's different state to state, because like North Carolina's more country. I live in Florida, and we still use the word genius because we have NASA, we have all of that here. So we're allowed to use the word genius. What's the teach center in North Carolina won't allow that. you identify as that. Like my psychologist even mentioned, there's different levels of genius. So you could use the utter spelling of genius to identify if you want to. It's creative. And North Carolina won't let you do that. That's like the difference. But this being on the spectrum, I was diagnosed at 4. I was able to get early intervention, the help that I needed and everything growing up. And for example, I went to college at UNCG and studied social justice, for disability rights. And that has helped people advocate here. There's a different type of ableism in Florida than what you would have in North Carolina. You have the Scott Center for Autism in Florida. That's very similar to Teat Center, but it's just different. I would say ableism is different in every state. It varies state to state, country to country. When you have some ableism anywhere, but every place is going to be different.
I feel like a big thing that I see and experience is internalized ableism. I'm just noticing even now, like, okay, what does my face look like? Like, and as being a panelist on this topic, it's like, it's just hard to, even when we completely have set everything up to be made for autistic people, I still am noticing that I'm like trying to make sure that I am presenting in a certain way so that people, trust my autistic perspective. So that feels like probably an answer to, most autistic people I know experience internalized ableism, and then also where the neurotypical privilege comes in of like not even considering that not even considering having to think about how we like look or how people are seeing us in different spaces.
As I'm thinking about what everyone's sharing, I want to share about my experience going through an autism evaluation. And I am an occupational therapist. I have a child that was diagnosed as autistic when they were pretty young. And I started exploring my own neurodivergence. And when I first started kind of outwardly talking about it rather than just internalizing it, like thinking it could be, I got a lot of, no, you don't look like, that's not that, like you're, and a lot of comments of, that's not what autism is. You have PTSD, you have anxiety, you have ADHD, a lot of other diagnoses that I feel like are more accepted and are more of what people's perceptions of what those presentations look like. So when I went to get evaluated, it was a similar experience with the clinician that all of these other things that I was checking all the boxes of what autistic characteristics were, but they also could be these. So because it wasn't fitting into what an autistic perspective and what and also had the feedback of being too capable, that you can't be autistic if you're able to do other things. And really also for ADHD, a lot of the things kind of on the questionnaires and on things, we as a professional, like knowing some of these things are we actually evaluating for autism or ADHD, or we really are, if people have learned to mask and have learned to do things, and like one of the questions was, are you late? And I said, no, I'm never late, because I am 2 hours before the thing very nervous and anxious that I'm going to be late. So I'm parked in the parking lot and doing all these things. So thinking about how we're showing up in professional spaces and how there's so many barriers for things because there's such a limited view of what we allow ourselves to think of what autistic experience is.
Could I also add to that, that I believe ableism is something that's already woven into the fabric of diagnoses, because a lot of the terminology used, a lot of the science used is based on the ableist perspective. That they're saying, you, just like she said, like I went to a place for an assessment. I took and went to this place, the same place I took my son to when he was 3, and they told me that my son was not, he could never be autistic because he was able to blow a kiss to me from across the room. Therefore, it took 6 years for me to finally get a diagnosis for him. I went back to the same place for an assessment, and I was given the diagnosis of CPTSD, which I already had. And they again were telling me that I couldn't be autistic. However, when I was sent to another place for a 3-day assessment, they said they saw everything autistic about me. And also the same organization that we went to first, when they saw my son at the age of 16, immediately went to him and offered all kinds of classes and things to him. So I was like, okay, they can see his autism now, but they couldn't see it at the age of 3. So these are kinds of things that we deal with, but we deal with it because ableism is already present. Before you even get the diagnosis, they already have a list of things that we shouldn't be able to do. And they don't even consider the fact that we may have comorbidity. Like for me, I'm usually late to going places because I have agoraphobia. So it's extremely difficult for me to leave the house. And I go through all my trauma is from having to get dressed and going through the process of going to a place when it's at its worst. It's almost just impossible to get to a place on time. So, but that doesn't make me less autistic. So I just wanted to add that as well. Thank you.
I would agree with that. I think also men that are Black are stylish. Women, their style can also make them not pass. And that's also a racism and a one size fits all. Sexism kicks in when you have people who don't fit the mold. Like we all need to be well groomed. We all need to shower. I think that's common sense. And for example, not being autistic enough, a Black nerd is usually more stylish than a white nerd. For example, there's the Matthew Rushton case in Virginia, and that's another subject. But yeah, he didn't pass as autistic when he had his car wrecked. He ended up in the prison system. Another subject. But just speaking of that, there's different cultures and societies where people who are Black might not pass for being autistic. That's the bias. Because the psychologists are just psychologists. They're not social workers where they understand the sociology aspect. Besides, they're ethnocentric. So that's the problem.
Thank you all for sharing your personal stories as it connected with that question, and for I think those responses really kind of showed the ways that ableism shows up in many different places. And Bren, thank you for bringing in that layer of how it intersects with race and gender. Well, we'll get more into that later in the panel too, so feel free to expand on that. The next question that I want to send to you is, how does ableism show up in language about autism, about autistic individuals? What ways do you see language in the ways that the community is labeled, described? How do you see that? How do you see ableism showing up there?
Okay, but before I answer, I'm sorry. When did you want people to ask questions? Because I thought I saw someone raise their hand to ask a question. I think it was Miss Godwin. Miss Godwin, is she able to ask a question, or do they need to wait until afterward?
I was gonna wait to do all the questions at the end.
Okay, thank you. I just didn't know. I didn't want her to think that we didn't see her.
Oh, thank you for clarifying.
Kind of weird. Yeah, I'm kind of weird about that. So some of the language you're saying that we see, I think a lot of it for me has been different questions. When I have spoken on many different panels, and sometimes when I speak to people on my home, they like to call a video call on the phone or whatever. And I find that rather than them just talking to me like we would talk, they're looking past me into my home. They want to see how the autistic person's home looks. They want to see how the autistic person lives. Why is your house so dark? I don't like artificial light. So I have as little light on at night as possible because it irritates me. For having to feel like I have to explain or expose myself because I'm always on display is something that happens quite a bit. It's almost like I live in a petri dish. Even when I'm speaking at some other occasions, I feel as though that people are looking at me as if to say, "Ooh, she can walk, she can talk, she can raise a son. Oh, she lives alone, or she raises, she has her own home. She works." All of these assumptions that people would think that I would not be able to do because of a diagnosis. So that's my experience.
I'm thinking about the different ways and the different hats I wear in my experience in being part of the autistic community. Being an autistic person myself, being a parent of an autistic child, being a professional that supports autistic people, and then an advocate for neurodiversity in our community. And I think something that feels a space that I guess I've been thinking about a lot lately is feeling like how to be the best advocate. How am I showing up authentically in those spaces while also like not feeling like I'm masking or in a way that feel it's this like very delicate balance of feeling like I want to advocate for the best I can in a space that has ableism already. So feeling like I need to kind of present myself in a certain way, using the language of what those people in different spaces understand. So functioning labels is something that I think we can just talk about, and especially in professional spaces, going to different meetings and talking about the level of support or a classroom placement or a support that someone may need, feeling like accurately describing and advocating in a way that's going to get that person the support they need, but doing it in a way that, so functioning labels, I'm meaning high functioning, low functioning. And the reason why that is ableist and problematic is that referring to a person as high functioning is diminishing their awareness for their needs, that probably that person is able to mask or able to pass in a space. So feeling like society says, oh, well, they don't really need an accommodation, or they're okay enough, even though that might be however harmful to them. Low functioning is assuming incompetence of a person. And basically the other thing is that other people are always fluctuating between their needs depending on the level of support of that environment or just how they're doing in that day. So using functioning labels is something that's still, I believe, to be pretty common in spaces, but kind of feeling the balance between I am not using those labels myself, but I also want to make sure that I'm able to advocate for someone that needs that support in language that other people are understanding.
I feel like there's a lot with what you said that about functioning labels, and also just like how to communicate to people that are not, well, one, that are not autistic, but also people that are not like learning about the problematic language, and just figuring out how to cross that bridge feels really difficult. So the ableism in language feels like it's just related, it's just it's coming from all directions, because then we have to communicate within that, even to talk about ourselves. And a lot of times
Elon Musk lives in Florida, and he's on the spectrum, and he designs all that engineering stuff. and he's like seen as a god here in Florida. So that's just an example of North Carolina versus Florida and how forward the engineering and Asperger's career. There's a lot of career opportunities here than what there is up there. That's like another subject.
If I could also add to that, I live in North Carolina, and I see many opportunities for people who are very well educated on the spectrum. I see an assumption that if our traits are not as visible, that the assumption is that we are genius level, whether we are or not. It's neither here nor there to me, but there's the assumption. The divide that I find in North Carolina is that if you have a certain education level, that your opinion is more valued than someone who has a lesser education value. The way that you describe it should fit more within how it's seen in documented cases or from books. But if you have your own way of coming up and expressing what you're experiencing, it doesn't resonate as well. People always, I find that if you do not have as much of an education, that you are considered a liability in terms of sharing information. So
That's true. I used to live there. I grew up in I was born in Pennsylvania, but I grew up in North Carolina.
Yeah.
We have family in Florida too, but Florida is just different. It's less country than North Carolina.
Right. But I'm just thinking in terms of, I see the divide more so between academia and non-academic settings. So it kind of depends, I think, on what your experience is. And also I wanted to address in terms of the high or the low functioning or whatever that nonsense is. For me, a lot of my traits don't show up because I was not allowed to have those things. I was not allowed to STEM. That is something that you were punished for severely. So in some cases, it could be abuse. In other cases, it could be masking. I don't necessarily mask much, but what I did do was I taught myself how to speak slower, because my normal voice is just very kind of squeaky and nasally. People don't really listen to me. So I started speaking slower and lowered my voice a little bit. And it seemed to be that people would take me more seriously at that time. So that's pretty much all I want to add.
Thank y'all. I think one thing that could be interesting to ask sort of directly in relation to this question is the kind of the decision as you're speaking to use person first or identity first language. And I wondered if you all would be able to briefly maybe create a distinction between the two, and then how that impacts the disabled community at large, but also the autistic community.
I am not an extremely word-centric person for certain things. What I found that was most impactful in terms of person first, saying instead of saying an autistic person, but a person with autism, I identify as an autistic person. I do not necessarily identify as a person with autism, because it almost makes me feel as though I carry my autism with me in my purse. So I don't carry it with me. It's part of my identity. It's part of who I am. I see myself as an autistic person. However, I do not have a problem with someone who chooses to be person first. I think that's an individual choice. What I don't like about it is the divide that is caused in the autism community. So that's something, you know, if anyone wants to expound on that. I don't think that we need more. I don't think we need to focus so much on the words. Yes, words are very important. But my thing is, as long as you are treating me with dignity and respect, and it's mutual, and we are getting along, and you're not judging me and pushing me aside because you feel like, everyone, that's my son, because you feel like my ability is limited, or if you want to constantly remind me that you keep forgetting that I'm autistic because you don't see traits, you know, as long as it's not something like that, I really don't care. I just don't want to see however we choose to label ourselves and how we express ourselves to become a wedge between our getting to know each other and to respect each other's opinions.
I agree with that. I think, you know, we shouldn't say you're black, so you can't have autism, or you have dreadlocks. You can't identify as a black nerd. Like it's all this nonsense stuff that white supremacy has played a role in the ableist community. You know, it's like if you're autistic, you have to fit our standard of autism, and that's you know the problem. Like I identify as the person who has ASD, like on the spectrum, or I just identify as a black nerd or an aspie. Like I claim that term, even though they identify it all with autism. I think even someone who has a different level of autism still can identify as an aspie if they want to. You know, creativity exists in different forms. They don't have to talk to be creative. You know, Albert Einstein didn't talk until he was 4. So if you add that up,
I was waiting. I identify as an autistic person and as a late identifying autistic person who was and still is very aware of rules and what I was taught and what I explicitly just was constantly scanning as a professional in school that learned you don't say autistic, you say person with autism, and you say person with a disability, you say special needs, all the terms that I was taught this is right, this is wrong, which made me feel very like it's very good to know this is the right thing, this is the wrong thing. And so when I started reading and listening to autistic people who said, actually, no, that doesn't feel good to me, it kind of shook me a little bit because I said, but wait, this was the rule. Why this doesn't make sense when the rules change? So it was definitely something that I had to process and internalize a little bit and unpack my own internalized ableism. And as I felt more comfortable understanding and reading why it really, for me, feels like the systems that and so ableism, racism, all the things that are systems that hold power of other people. I think where it feels uncomfortable and where I agree with Jackie and Remington about their view of really wanting to connect the community and not have divides. I think I value the autistic community's stance to present this as more of this is what autistic people are saying, why this feels really important to use this language, because it doesn't feel like a stigma and it doesn't feel like something that we have to say in a different term because we're kind of embarrassed by it, or it doesn't feel like we want to insult somebody by saying they're a person with autism. Or I think it feels like, especially in professional spaces where I think professionals that went to school and are learning to be experts, it kind of feels like a humbling experience to learn something that you thought and taught is the best thing actually might be hurtful. So I think as a professional, that was something that I had to process through, and something that I continue to kind of hopefully share in those spaces, because I think it is uncomfortable to feel like we might be doing something and not intentionally because we thought it was the right thing, but feeling like, why is this hurtful, and kind of just exploring a little bit more about it.
And I agree with you on that, Jenna. I just wanted to add this. I think this brings a really important topic up in terms of the training of the professionals. I think most professionals go into the field thinking about in terms of helping someone or fixing a person who might be broken, even, if you will. There's no cultural humility in the education realm. If we had more cultural humility, then maybe professionals would come into a situation wanting to ask more questions like, how do you identify? You know, how do I relate to you as an individual, as a person, as opposed to how I relate to the group of you who have a similar diagnosis? I think that's something that should be brought up more often. And I would like to see that happen within the education realm, because that's when change really happens, when you change the people that are actually providing the service and how they see the people that they are serving. Thank you for bringing that up.
Agreed. Because North Carolina is like Florida is actually more blue collar than North Carolina. Speaking of the education like expectations, because we're technically the deep South, even though we're like a Catholic state, which is another subject. We're in the deep South, so we're like Georgia, but more on the Caribbean side. So speaking of that, there's more empathy for people who are receiving services. As is up there in North Carolina, it's the opposite way around, because North Carolina is richer than Florida. They have higher taxes, stuff like that. But at the same time, people that go into that field, usually or see themselves as helping. People with disabilities don't really have a voice up there like they do down here. That's like one of the differences. Because I'm a peer mentor. I work with disabled people here in the area that I live in, Florida, and we provide services to people with disabilities.
When you're talking about your training, Jenna, it made me think of my grad school program as well. I have an MSW, and I did not know that I was autistic during that program. And while I was learning things in our single class offered about disabled people, it was all talking about person first language and how that was the right thing to do and the most important thing to do. And at the time, I didn't even question it. And now looking back at it, it's like, where was that information coming from? That's a big part for me, is like, were autistic people telling me that this is what they want? And obviously no, which is how the community's gotten to this point of talking about autistic people. But also I agree with what everyone's been saying about the within the autism community. It feels different than people outside of it trying to like put labels on us versus us putting our own labels on ourselves.
Awesome, y'all. Thanks so much. A lot to reflect on from those comments. I've put some definitions in the chat if you haven't seen it yet, that are the definitions that we're working from on ableism and on masking. And if you want to look at those, particularly for the next question, is how does masking connect to ableism? Generally, or in your personal experience. We've touched on that a little bit, but if there are any more specific examples, or if you wanted to expand, that's the question.
For my personal experience, masking is being shoved into a space where you have to lie, where you're not able to experience who you are. If you are forced to mask early in life, and I say forced masking because, again, if I showed my traits, my parents were displeased, and they took measures to make sure that I did not show those traits and embarrass them. How that has affected me over time is, here I am I'm 56 years old and I'm having to try to figure out who I am, because my entire life I had to present the way that it was considered acceptable to present. And so when we talked about stemming, I had to really look at myself and see, do I stem? And I do, but I couldn't identify it as stemming because I knew whatever I did in front of my parents had to stop. And it's very damaging. I've even heard professionals say you want to stop your children from stemming. Anytime that you tell a person from the very beginning that how they are, who they are organically are is incorrect and it's not right, then we automatically, as human beings, we want to be accepted and we want to sometimes please the people that we're around, whether it be parents or a spouse or friends, or just wanting to try to fit in, you know, when we're in school and doing all kinds of things to try to be acceptable. Instead of first being able to accept ourselves and then to be able to present ourselves and have more of a voice about who we are. We shouldn't have to be forced to be anything, but we find that we have to be able to be mainstreamed, if you will. That is the privilege, if you want to talk about privilege, of people who are not neurodiverse, people, and ableism. It is the privilege that causes other people to have to change. That's the thing that's the worst outcome, is that we have to try to fit into a space to make other people comfortable. That when you're talking about training, it's always the person who's diagnosed that has to have the training, but everyone else doesn't. So in a work situation, if you want to train an autistic person and help them to be more successful in the workplace, shouldn't that be a two-way street? Should they also, you know, should the non-autistic individuals be trained on how to be more empathetic? I think the very thing, everything that we are held accountable for are the very things that most regular people, I find, tend to struggle with. I'm told that I have no empathy because I'm autistic, but where's your empathy for even telling me such? So.
Very true. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, about the privilege is that, you know, it's supposed to be a two-way street. I think people with Asperger's, we don't have trouble with empathy. I think we just have a different way of expressing it. And a lot of people just aren't used to anything that they're not used to, they're not accustomed to. Like they're afraid of the unknown. That's, you know, part of stigma, like any stigma, not just mental health, but gut health or anything. Because I work in healthcare as a dietary technician. I can tell you there's a lot of stigmas with a lot of different things besides just that. But you know, this it's different from region to region. That's one thing to keep in mind. Like North Carolina is different than Florida, and Florida is different than California. So it's, every place is different. California had the first curb cut. That's another subject for disabled people.
I feel the original question was, how does masking connect to ableism? And I feel like ableism creates masking, like creates the need for masking. And now I'm at the point where I'm like, when am I not masking? Like being able to find the times when I'm not masking, which reminds me of what you said too, Jackie, about like figuring out who you even are, of like, and ways that it took me 30 years to figure out that I was autistic was because of, you know, I have friends. I can't be autistic because I have friends. And I like, you know, I don't stim. Picking my nails or like playing with my rings, that's not stimming. That's just, you know, whatever, normal stuff. So all these stereotypes about autism, and which all come from ableism, it's made me mask to the point where I hid it from myself that I was autistic. And now that the pandemic is happening and that I'm not really around groups of people very often or at all, it's become more difficult to continue masking the way that I could in the past, which feels like I'm losing privilege in some ways because I've been able to like hide myself enough in certain situations to like gain more privilege. And now I can't do that. And now I'm like, well, okay, here I am yeah, masking is a thing I think about a lot. So it makes me think about all of these questions too.
Yeah, what you just said, Michelle, really resonates with me. And Jackie said before, just kind of realizing and getting or identifying as autistic, then kind of actually processing who you are. I think it feels my existence before understanding and exploring my neurodivergence was a very blocked off, I think, version of myself. I didn't talk often. The things I was saying were very scripted things that I knew was what people wanted or the rules that I understood them to be. When I saw something that I knew, I think this, just as a general, I think neurodivergent people have a very, as Remington said, very high sense of empathy and work really passionately in social justice spaces because we see and feel those things so deeply. So when I would see something that wasn't right, I would want to say something but unsure of how to say it because I knew that isn't how the system was working and wanted me to say it. So a lot of things I wasn't able to say and kind of masked. So I feel like, especially in the past few years, I feel like I'm a completely different person because now everything's just coming out because I'm able to express myself, which I don't think I really ever could. And I think the way that neurodivergent people, I was going to share something and I'm going to put it in the chat if that's okay, T. It's the neurodivergent love languages. And this feels like something like when I am able to have spaces with other autistic or neurodivergent people that are feel comfortable. Info dumping is like the way that feels so good to just get everything out, be so passionate about it, let someone else do it back. But that's not really enjoyable in neurotypical spaces, apparently. That you're not supposed to just kind of get really excited and talk about something that's passionate and you have to like have this back and flow. But to be able to force myself to make eye contact, to not get too excited about something that I'm really excited about, to pause and let the conversation go to something that's boring or chit chat that I don't really care about, and all those things, it just feels like I'm just having to like not really participate in that space the way it feels good. And when that happens, all my things that are important to me that feel good that I have ideas about aren't able to get out. And that's, I think, how I lived my life with this heavy mask. And now that I don't have to do that or feel safe to take it off in spaces, I feel like I'm saying things that feel good and are exciting to say that I didn't feel like I ever had before. And I think that's especially for children or places where it feels like masks are so needed and masking doesn't feel safe not to, that we're not allowing autistic or neurodivergent people to express themselves or share the things that they really have amazing ideas about.
I would agree with that. You know, the thing is related to autism, you know, like masking. And I was born up north, you know, speaking of what your name was saying, you know, like if, up north, you know, we're very direct. We're not afraid to hurt feelings. We're just like a free spirit kind of mindset. And I think, you know, North Carolina and like the South, you know, they don't like to rock the boat. You know, like they say there's a difference between being blunt versus being rude. And I think, you know, Florida, you know, they're Southern, but they still rock the boat, sort of, I guess you could say. It's part of our Haitian history, which is another subject.
Well, and I grew up in the Midwest, which is, you know, you just have to be nice all the time and say the things that people want to hear.
Similar to the South. I mean, I studied my geography. I mean, the Midwest and the South both have the highest obesity rate. That was on my nutrition exam, so we learned about that.
It's so funny because I always said that I learned how to lie from my parents because the truth wasn't acceptable. And if it didn't like what you were saying, then you had to say it a different way. So you weren't allowed to be honest. I remember I just said an honest thing, got slapped in the face, and I was just like, I couldn't understand why honesty was not well received. But things like believing in Santa Claus, which I never believed in, that was forced down my throat. So is it, like I said, oftentimes the things that are told to us, the standard that is set for us is a standard that cannot be kept by the person who set the actual standard to begin with. So.
Exactly. I think up north they're less like that. My father was on the spectrum, and he just walked out of the house. My grandma used to beat him and everything. He walked out of the house, but my mom had me. It's a long story. Him and my mom were in a band, but that's what you do up north. You're allowed to talk back to your family because they're not always right. They're not God. So, for example, that's what my father did. He just walked out and then had me, and that was just expected. I think the South and the Midwest is just different. It's a power grab type thing.
Well, it's certainly interesting the different ways that all of these things, ableism, like shows up anywhere across the world, but also there are certain ways that interacts with different regions, different countries, different cultural expectations, and yeah, it intersects. That kind of goes into our last question about how ableism does intersect with other marginalized identities, such as race and gender. Like, how do you all see and or experience those intersections?
When I think about it, it all resonates the same way. It's always, there is the privilege of the group, or should I say, what's the term? Majority rules. So whoever the majority is, they're the ones who set the rules. And if you don't fit in the majority, then you experience the ableism. So whether it be race, whether it be gender, whether it be size, people have asked me, what is it like to have a disability in terms of my autism? And I never thought of my autism as a disability. What was a disability to me was being obese. That was more of a disability because there were certain places I couldn't fit. The way people treated me was so very different. I couldn't get help as often, I would be ignored more. And then when I started losing weight, all of that changed. So it just kind of just depends on who the majority is, what the rule is, and how you fit with the majority. And that kind of guides how much ableism you're going to experience.
This also makes me think of the perceived gender and why potentially me and many people I know who are perceived as girls and raised and socialized as girls are not diagnosed earlier because of ableism within the research about autism, and just within systems of this is what autism looks like. Autism is only for boys, and it's all these specific things that obviously people don't fit into. And just thinking about too of how, regardless of my perceived gender, I can't imagine autism and gender being separate because of being autistic. That's why and how I understand gender. And so to me, it's they go together, and then there's all the complicated things with people treating you from the outside in certain ways because of gender perceptions, obviously along with race and size and religion, all kinds of things that contribute to how ableism is affecting each person.
I would agree with that. I would say that, for example, even race, because black masculinity It's different than white masculinity, and a lot of white societies don't want to think that. For example, black men were still sexualized by the white slave master, and it was a man who was not, gay, but still took advantage of the black slave. It's a man, it's a man on man in the South. Like up north, a lot of times you don't separate groups by gender or by race as much as they do in the South. That's another subject. But for example, black masculinity, you go to like prisons or jails, you're going to see a lot of black men with dreadlocks or with their hair braided. You see like white men, they don't do that as much. That's like another subject. So if a person on the spectrum has fashion or some style, it might not pass as autistic, and that's still a problem.
I'm thinking about my experience as an occupational therapist, and then also thinking about barriers for just diagnosis, as well as barriers, and then also racial reality that Black teenagers especially have, where they're presenting to be and autistic, really feeling a more scared feeling of, is this a safe space for me to, am I welcome in this community? Is this having this diagnosis in my record going to be more, is this helpful, or is this going to give more danger already to different prejudices? And I think just an experience thinking about children that I'm working with or advocating for, and thinking of children that are perceived to have behavioral problems versus children who are neurodivergent who need support, and thinking of how racism and ableism for autistic, I'm thinking especially people socialized as males, and people of color, specifically Black children, have these huge huge barriers that, when we think of how are we supporting, are we recognizing school to prison pipeline, and how, when we are hoping to give support, is this something that, because there's all these systems that have racism and ableism, that how are we doing more to protect students that aren't going to be understood? And I think I'm not sure if I'm explaining this in a clear way, but thinking of how all these barriers are here, and I guess I'm just asking, what are we doing to dismantle some of them? Because as Remington said, Matthew Rushkin is a really, really good example, and that's something else that I could also put in the chat too, if it's okay. But
It actually helped them get, because I studied political science. I helped his family file a lawsuit against the prison. That's another subject. For example, even the education system, you're not covered by HIPAA until you go to prison. That's like another subject related to the law. For example, FERPA covers school privacy, but once you're in prison, it's a medical service because it's a mental institution of the government. That's like another subject.
I hope that we can come back and broach that subject specifically, that there's so much that needs to be said and done especially when you're looking at the climate that has developed over the last few years. Not that it hasn't been here, but now that it's gained momentum, and it's not in the closet anymore, if you will, that it's out, and that's a thing that has always been, it's always been an undercurrent. And I think if you're looking at things racially, and you're looking at privilege, regardless to who the group is, privilege is almost a state of having blinders on, because your privilege allows you not to have to see other people's plight. You don't even have to address it. And that's why a lot of these things seem so far out when it rose to the surface and became more publicized, because more people have their smartphones, they can take video and they can share these things instantly, whereas before it was more kind of in the cover of night that these things would happen. But this is a situation that has affected people, especially people that have intellectual disabilities or any kind of neurodivergence, oftentimes ending up in prison and staying longer terms because they may not understand that what they're doing is getting them in deeper trouble, and there are very few resources for them, very few allies. So I'm just saying, I hope that we can put this subject on the table again, because it's not something that just affects us, it is global. And if we can find an answer, I would surely love to get that answer out there.
We are going to dive deeper into that topic in April. So keep looking out on the website to be able to register for that one. Okay, thank you all so much. And that was a lot of time and energy and expertise that went into those questions. We have about 14 minutes that we can get into questions from the audience. I'm gonna expand my screen so I can see more folks, but people can, you please add your question to the chat room, or you can raise your hand and I will indicate to you that you can ask your question. And you, I think to raise your hand, you go into the reactions button.
I was wondering if Miss Godwin, I haven't forgotten you, Miss Godwin. I was wondering if you wanted to raise your question now.
No, hello everyone. I was just trying to get, hold on a second. I apologize, I'll be right back. I'm sorry. I was just trying to get a better understanding of ableism. I was reading it and it was like Greek to me. I've been working with the autistic population since '99 because I worked at Murdoch and Butner. And it's a word that I had never, ever heard before. So you can read something. It was just like I was reading like another language, but I'm like, how can they put it in a nutshell?
In a nutshell, ableism is behaviors and language and systems that put a person in a negative light or diminishes their value or speaks negatively about them because, whether because of a diagnosis, because of race, because of education, for whatever reason. Ableism is a way of looking at person and looking down at that person. I'm thinking if you're working at places like Murdoch and whatnot, oftentimes in a population where traits tend to be much more visible, especially in situations where the individual may be nonverbal, or may have a lot of communication difficulties, you may not hear that term come up. That term oftentimes comes up with a person because they are expressing a thing that they are experiencing. And it's a label that was given. And when we saw this label, we say, yeah, this is it. This is for us who are able to say, we don't like the way that we're being treated because, or we don't like the way that we've been treated because we have this diagnosis, or because we behave in a certain way, or when someone looks at us and diminishes us. Now, I will say in the Black community, ableism is not a word that's oftentimes used of, because we go through that because of our race. So we're diminished because of our skin color. We're diminished because of whatever neighborhood we live in. We're diminished because of so many different things, but we didn't think of it in terms of ableism. It was just life. So maybe in your situation, it's just life and it doesn't have a label. But anytime someone points at a person or looks at a person or speaks of a person in a negative light because they have a disability, that is ableism. If that makes more sense to you.
And I know working at Murdoch, I read a lot of books on the residents, and a lot of them came at the age of 5. They, some of them had some good age on them. But it also made me think, when I was in school, I don't remember ever seeing anyone that, had autism, that had Down syndrome. I don't remember seeing any of those groups of people when I was in school. I don't remember ever seeing anyone STEM. I mean, I see it now with my students, but I never heard or saw this when I was in school that I know of, unless they was able to, I'm going to use a word that you all have here, unless they were able to mask it.
Well, and I saw it, and for me, it was always, how do I present this? Because this is a common term that people have talked about when we talk about our school experience. When groups of people often talk about that one kid that they see who appeared disheveled most of the time, or maybe wasn't clean, maybe had some body odor or something. That was that person that people would identify as different. Didn't know if there was a diagnosis or anything. But this is when I talk to people that are my age and we talk about school, we always talk about that one person. Like I was that one person that was disheveled. You know what I'm saying, in the group, or that 1 or 2 or 3 people that never seemed to quite fit in with other people. But it wasn't a question of diagnosis, there might be some other kind of label, a negative label, but a label nonetheless, but it wouldn't be a diagnosis. So I think we're always around. We've always been around. And in many situations, there are kids who do have a diagnosis, are getting therapy, but their parents don't tell them that they have a diagnosis. So they go through life knowing that they've had some special classes and mainstream classes, but they don't identify as having a diagnosis. So
and then behind it, not to cut you off, Ms. Love, it makes me think also, as things are not, as Mr. Brown was saying, like in our group of people. A lot of things we're not taught growing up, and a lot of things are like set, like we'll just pray about it or whatever. I think pray, I'm not knocking it.
Right.
But a lot of things like I'm so glad now, and I'm just talking for me, I'm so glad to see so many varieties of people, that are speech therapists, that are, all these different service providers. And so I worked at a preschool from 6 to 9. And then we had 14 students in a class, 7 typical, 7 delayed. We had a student there that didn't know the A from the B and the 1 to 3, but at the same time, when the psychiatrist came and tested her, she tested out where she could not receive any services because, well, I'm gonna say what my teacher said. She said her street smart kicked in. So she passed the test, even though, so there's times when our people need help, but some of those service providers, either the student tests out, or I've seen this working at the preschool more. I can only speak about what I see. I know there's all races and all nationalities. I'm telling you what I'm involved with. There's a lot of times just working in different places where you can see that our children need help. That's why I'm so thankful for Miss Border and different ones that work with my students that are trying to help my people. And so I've often had to tell my parents, if these people are willing to help you, let them help you. I said, because what I've seen a lot of times, those people are not trying to help us. You know, they can see that we need help. They can see that our children need help, but they don't want to provide it, or they'll just say, oh, because we had a speech therapist that told us once one child, she kept telling us, you know, the teachers, oh, he doesn't need speech. But, you know, she would tell the parents, oh, yeah, he needs speech. Or a lot of times the parents would have them get speech in the school. Plus, they took them to an outside agency to get speech as well. So I'm so thankful for these new service providers that are helping everyone.
Thank you.
That's a good point, because I've actually done time at Murdoch myself as a teenager. And, you know, there was a lot of ableism there when I was there. For example, there was recently segregation lawsuits against the Department of Health and Human Services because they were segregating people with disabilities. Another subject, won't go fully into it, but you can read about it.
Thank y'all. We've got a question from Orla.
Hi. I don't know how to, oh, there we go. Put my hand down. Thank you all for sharing. I had a question for Jenna. I think it was you that brought up earlier your experience with people saying like, oh, that's not what autism looks like, or like, you're not autistic, obviously, like, and I was just wondering, like, and other people can answer this as well, how do you respond to that? Like, even coming from like a professional standpoint, I don't know what to say.
Yeah, thanks, Orla. That's a great question. Immediately my stomach is in a knot, and I know, okay, this is a person I'm gonna go full mask. Because I feel like still another term that is, I think, in autistic spaces is talking about imposter syndrome, and that's something especially kind of right now, like being out there, like, you know, I'm not masking right now as much as like being out there doing this, feeling like am I is this okay to take this space, and is it okay to identify? Because I've had people say, no, you're not, and no, this isn't okay, you're taking space that isn't there for you. And I think for so much of my experience in life, I didn't feel like I had really space. My space was to make sure I was giving to other people and doing things that I thought I was supposed to do. So kind of also how Michelle shared that the pandemic has given kind of this kind of time and space to just check in. And as I'm exploring myself and figuring out how it feels right and how I want to spend my energy and who I want to share things with, I think as I grow in my ability to present and kind of feel comfortable publicly identifying as autistic, I think I share more frequently, but I also am aware when I'm in a high ableist space, or there's people that are demonstrating using language that is not comfortable, or like, I feel like I'm kind of weighing the balance of how am I protecting myself, because I could spurt out, that's ableist, I could give you a million things, but how is that going to be perceived? Is that helpful? So I feel like I am very frequently trying to pause and check in of how do I want to choose to respond right now? Do I feel like it is worth my energy to advocate, and how might be the best way that this is helpful and perceived. So I hope that's helpful. Tell me if that didn't make any sense.
No, that was helpful. Thank you.
I wanted to add a little bit to that, and I thought it was very well said, Jenna. Thank you so much. I oftentimes get, especially now, I think in the most recent months, people are telling me, I keep forgetting that you're autistic. One person even said 99% of the time she forgets that I'm autistic. I try to come from a space, being a human being and understanding that I myself am not perfect. So I know that I'm dealing with people that are not perfect. And I try to have empathy towards a person who may be saying that because they may think that it makes me feel better that they can't see the autism, or they may be questioning if I'm actually autistic. I can't say because I can't determine what that is. However, my response is generally the same, is I think that you need not focus on recognizing me as an autistic person, but getting to know me as a person. There will be times that you may see my traits more than other times. Learn that about my autism and understand that my autism is not going to look like someone else's autism. And if we just learn how to get to know each other as individuals, that we would be much better off, whether diagnosis is in place or not. Also, and it's trying to escape my mind as I'm talking, but I think that, let's see if I can get it back real quick, because I know we don't have much time, and I may not be able to get it back. If I can get it back, I see someone else has a question. I don't want to waste time, but if I can get it back, I'll try to come back in.
Thanks, Jackie. Yeah, well, if you want to, we can do that. Yeah, we have time for one more question from Sharon, and then we'll go. And I know some of you might need to go ahead and scoot out. Anyone who's in now will get and who had registered will get the recording. It should have closed captioning added to it. Yeah, thanks for joining. Okay, Sharon, your question.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the panel who has spoken today. I just wanted to ask the question. There's this show that comes on Hula. It's called The Good Doctor. I don't know if anybody is familiar with that show, but it shows this doctor who portrays to be autistic. And he's very intelligent, and he can see things that regular normal people just can't see. It's like he has skills and abilities because of his autism that makes him seem or portray as if he's a very smart, intelligent person. But yet when it comes to common things such as noise, or it comes to working, in an environment with a lot of noise or a lot of people or certain things like that, then it's like his autism comes out more. What do you think about shows that focus on people who have autism or being autistic? Do you think they're portraying people with autism very well? Do you think it's enlightening the public about autism? What are your comments on that?
I think that shows that portray autism, number one, I'm not really for people pretending to be autistic. I like to see more people who are actually autistic play those roles if they so choose to. But I think it's a way to introduce the idea of autism to people. But I feel also that it's also misused because it further reiterates people saying autism must look like a certain thing. And autism doesn't have a certain look. Traits present differently. So what we are seeing when we see The Good Doctor, we are seeing the traits of a person. And that should not be applied to all people that have the same diagnosis.
There is a show, oh, what is it called? Hold on, I have to get rid of this cat. Okay. Everything's Gonna Be Okay, I think is the name of the show. And it's written by an autistic person, and like what Caroline's saying in the chat, created by an autistic person. The actors are autistic people. It has multiple different characters who are autistic and shows like different ways of being autistic. It's very white, like full of white people. But the benefit, like the thing that's positive is it's made by autistic people and the actors are autistic. That's really the only show that I know about that's like that. I've heard of this, of The Good Doctor and of like Atypical. There's a few others, I think, but Everything's Gonna Be Okay is the one that I recommend if you want to watch something that has actual autistic representation in it.
I appreciate seeing, and I can't name anything offhand, but I have watched certain shows or movies and have seen a character and say, wow, that person appears to be neurodivergent, but I really appreciated that they weren't highlighted as being neurodivergent, because again, that highlights us as we are separate from the norm. We are here with you all the time, and we are a normal part of the fabric, just like everyone else. So I think it's good. I would prefer to see shows where, yes, people can be neurodivergent, but it's not necessarily highlighted like this is about the autistic person or whatever, but that you see a great many different kinds of people with different kind of characteristics, and they're just being people.
Agreed. I think, like Atypical is a good example. Me and my girlfriend watched that show because we both studied political science at UNCG for disabilities. And the guy on the show that plays this autistic guy, he's an example of the white example of autism. There could be like a black guy with braided hair, wearing like hip clothing. It could also be on the spectrum. You don't really have to have an unhip guy with glasses playing as a person with autism, which is a good movie and everything. Finds a relationship, he goes to college, but at the same time, it shouldn't be the primary example of autism. Is that image?
Right. And I just want to say one more thing. One of the ways I raised my son was to be around all kinds of people. So we were around people that had different kinds of disabilities. It didn't really matter what was: physical, emotional, mental, neurodivergent. He saw a lot of it. So when he is around people, like there was one person we were meeting for lunch, she was an amputee, both legs. She was afraid that my son was going to be afraid of her. And I said, he's not going to be afraid because he's used to seeing all kinds of people. I said, but what he will do is he's going to ask you to ride him around the restaurant on your wheelchair. So if you don't mind, give him a couple rides, But we just took that kind of aspect with our children and with ourselves and say, let's just get out here and just get to know people. My son is not going to freak out because someone has an oxygen tank, or someone is in a wheelchair, or someone walks differently, or someone talks differently. That's not a thing to him, because people are just people. Can we just be people?
That is our time. Thank you so much for sharing. Thank you, panelists, for sharing. And thank you all for being here to listen. I hope that there's things that you can reflect on, carry back with you to your work. And I encourage you to come back to see our future discussions, one every month. Thank you.